So I'm not going to mention that I'm the only woman in this conference. I'm not going to mention that the sociologists present way late in the day when everyone's tired. No, I'm just joking. I have one other, but I'll leave it at that. So it's by now well known. Oh, and my data is nowhere near as big as the data that you've been seeing, but I'm not doing my qualitative work today, so it's a little bit bigger than I usually do. So it's by now well known that contact with the penal system is associated with poor employment outcomes in the short and long term. Arrest, conviction, and incarceration are associated with reduced odds of getting a job, and once employed, reduced numbers of weeks worked and wages earned. As explanation, some point to justice-involved job seekers' pre-offense individual level attributes, since the characteristics that predict criminal behavior also help to explain poor employment outcomes post-offense. Others locate post-offense employment disadvantage in the loss of valuable human and social capital, which erodes with incarceration, assuming that folks had any at all. Most researchers, however, highlight the role that legal and social stigmas play in erecting institutional barriers to legitimate work in the formal economy. Specifically, they point to state and federal restrictions on access to government employment and government-regulated private industry. Employers' fears that they will be found liable for negligent hiring if justice-involved employees act criminally on a job, and employers' general distrust of a pool of job seekers who have been deemed or certified untrustworthy by the penal system. So in the end, institutional exclusion, I think, is the primary mechanism through which employment prospects of justice-involved people are significantly diminished. In this study, we highlight the importance of another pathway through which penal contact reduces the odds of finding work, and that's through job search. Despite almost 3 decades of research on the labor market experiences of justice-involved men, we know relatively little about whether and how such contact with the penal system alters job search, and that is whether or not people search for work, and among those who do search, what search strategies they deploy. This is a curious omission, since substantial demand-side employment barriers have real implications for job search engagement and search success. The justice involved would have to search with much greater effort and intensity to find work than their equally qualified, uninvolved counterparts, a point about which many of these justice-involved men and women know. It is unclear, however, that the justice-involved actually do search in ways that will improve their odds of finding work given their disadvantage. So we ask, so a couple of questions that we're interested in is, does penal contact affect whether or not the justice-involved search for work, and does penal contact shape how the justice-involved search for work? We are not the first, however, to raise this issue. Using the NLSY 97 Appel and Sweeten in a 2010 article in the Social Forces or Social Problems, I can't remember which, Social Problems, investigated the factors that lay behind incarceration's apparent effect on employment outcomes, contrasting the experiences of convicted youth who had not been incarcerated with those who had been incarcerated. And they showed that the formerly incarcerated youths were less likely to be employed, but that was primarily because they were less likely to search for work at all. They were labor force non-participants. So proportionately fewer searched. By highlighting the role of this form of detachment, Appel and Sweeten put job search front and center as a mechanism linking penal contact and employment. But we go beyond Appel and Sweeten's study in 2 ways. First, in addition to examining whether penal contact affects individuals' odds of searching for work, we also investigate how those who do search engage the process. This is for good reason. Search strategies vary significantly in terms of the quality and quantity of job information they produce, and the influence they are able to mobilize both for job seekers and employers. And thus, they differ as well in terms of the rates of job finding success that they yield. Because, for reasons that I'll elaborate on a little bit later, contact likely alters how justice-involved people search, and because post-contact patterns of search likely affect the odds of finding work, we consider both whether and how, not just whether, they search to be important pathways for further inquiry. Second, although Appel and Sweeten limit their attention to incarceration's effect on employment, we examine a broader category of penal contact. As previous research has shown, incarceration is not the only dispositional category that has a negative effect on the employment outcomes of those who've had contact with the penal system. Relative to pre-contact status, conviction and arrest do as well, although to varying degrees. So to the extent that this is true, it suggests that search may also be altered in ways for other types of penal dispositions. And it's also important to take into consideration because those who've been incarcerated represent a significant minority, but a minority of those who have contact with the penal system. The overwhelming majority of folks who have contact and are convicted are those who are convicted of misdemeanor crimes that don't produce sentences of incarceration. So by limiting their focus on those who've been incarcerated, they actually ignore the vast majority of people who have contact with the penal system. And so by taking all of those folks into consideration, I think we have a better sense about the impact that penal contact has in general. So we go beyond Appel and Sweeten in these ways. In general, when we, and very briefly, explain job search, at least from the job seeker's perspective, the benefits of searching are twofold. It's a primary means through which you gain information about vacancies and job offer packages, and it communicates to employers your availability. But job search is not costless. Searching takes time, it requires money, and it frequently involves opportunity costs, both present and future, including foregone earnings. Job seekers are theorized to end their searches and accept job offers at some optimal stopping point, which is when employers extend offers that are at or above some job seekers' reservation wage. To get to this point, job seekers are presumed to choose search behaviors, a variety of search behaviors that have the lowest potential costs or estimated costs and the highest benefits possible. But the estimations of search costs and benefits are complicated by at least three factors, and this is especially so with regards to those who've had contact with the penal system. The first is the quality and quantity of job opportunities that are available. So economists have argued that job seekers may be unwilling to search at all, much less with greater intensity, effort, and persistence, if there are too few job opportunities that are available of sufficient quality. For many justice-involved people, this is the current context. Not only have federal and state government restrictions restricted their access to government employment, they've also enacted numerous provisions against extending licenses to justice-involved people for government-regulated private occupations. The result has been devastating. Nationwide, roughly 800 occupations are formally off-limits to ex-offenders or ex-felons, and in Florida, 40% of jobs in large employment sectors were revealed to be off-limits on a fairly recent study. Even for defendants, those who've not been convicted of any crime, legal stigma forecloses access to some jobs while their cases remain open, and thus they're also vulnerable to sanction even before their cases are adjudicated and even if their cases are eventually dismissed. The quality of jobs that are available is generally poor as well. Before penal contact, justice-involved people generally struggle with employment already, and as I've stated before, garner low wages and work relatively few weeks per year and have poor annual earnings. After contact, however, employment prospects dim even further. According to Vischer and Kachnowski, of the minority of former prisoners from Illinois employed within 8 months of their release, the overwhelming majority worked in construction, manual labor, and maintenance, among the few industries still generally open to hiring ex-offenders. And they earned between $750 and $900 per month. Thus, after penal contact, these job seekers are compelled to expend much more effort to search for many fewer jobs that are available of any decent quality. In this context, choosing not to search for work or reducing the effort that one makes actually makes sense. Indeed, social psych research indicates that perceptions like these are associated with reduced search effort and withdrawal from search entirely. Another issue involves before search options. So economists have also contended that the poor and more unacceptable ones before search options, often conceptualized in terms of financial stress, that potential job seekers experience because of joblessness, unemployment, or underemployment, the greater one's motivation to search for more acceptable work arrangements. My situation is pretty crappy, so I'm heading back out to the market, right? We know that as job seekers' financial hardship increases, they initiate post-unemployment job search sooner. They deploy a greater number of methods to find work. They pursue more job leads, and they devote more hours to search activities each week. If financial stress informs search effort, then all things considered, the population from which the justice involved are disproportionately drawn should devote considerably more time and energy to search. But the financial stress associated with criminal justice contact may be so great as to discourage labor force participation altogether. Not often discussed is whether or not, or to what extent, the new work arrangements will enable job seekers to address the financial burdens they face. And I think we should talk a bit more about the financial burdens. It's not just that the jobs that are available to justice-involved men and women pay poverty-level wages on average. It is also that many are faced with crushing debts in the form of legal financial sanctions, including child support. According to Harris and her colleagues, white, Hispanic, black male felons have median legal debt loads that are roughly 60%, 36%, and 50% of their annual incomes, respectively. The mean debt loads are roughly 10%, 69%, and 222% for black male felons of their average annual earnings, respectively. Most could not afford to fulfill their obligations in the short term, and the accumulation of interest on court-imposed sanctions fulfillment over the long term is unlikely as well. Even small monthly payments could reduce take-home pay substantially, but most states have the authority to garnish much more. For legal fines and fees, states can extract as much as 35% of your wages, and for child support, it can be as much as 65%. So imagine taking that off of the $750 to $900 a month that you're making. And then think about what kind of motivation you have or incentive you have for getting to work. Such deductions from already meager earnings would make it near impossible to meet other obligations, such as buying groceries or paying rent. And importantly, these large debt liabilities can discourage work. Harris and her colleagues report that 80% of their respondents found that legal debt obligations were unduly burdensome. And their heightened financial stress actually had the unintended consequence of reducing their commitment to work and related search effort. Despite the possibility of jail time, even for non-payment, some of her respondents chose not to work, or their respondents chose not to work relying on crime, or where this was allowable for legal debtors, cash assistance. High child support arrears, balances, and aggressive enforcement policies have also been found to have similar effects on fathers' work effort. So in addition to the quality and quantity of available job opportunities and before search options, there's a question about the extent to which folks have the opportunity to search. So greater time and flexibility to search are associated with more intense, effortful, and persistent searches, but evidence suggests that with some penal interventions actually erode the time and flexibility for active and engaged search effort. Clearly, something like pretrial detention would have an impact on your ability to find work because you are behind bars. I guess you could always network, but it limits your possibilities there. You can understand that. Some relatively recent research also suggests that the kind of procedural hassles in court hearings that folks have to experience, because there are multiple numbers of these, they often are unpredictable and they take a long time out of your day, reduce the likelihood of finding work. And even some older research by Mercer Sullivan suggests that, and this is quite qualitative kind of ethnographic research. So he finds that a number of his respondents were stopped searching altogether after they had been arrested, in part because their cases had not yet been resolved and they were unclear what the resolution would be. It made no sense to devote time and effort to search because they could end up behind bars or some such thing. And so the unpredictability of the process combined with the hassles around court hearings made it so that people would postpone searches until those things had been resolved. And then, of course, there are the burdensome tasks associated with probation and parole or community sanction. community supervision. Contingent on offense, these might include community service, drug testing, drug and alcohol treatment, including treatment that you have to do inpatient. A significant minority of probationers also have their movements monitored and otherwise restricted. Although most of these obligations would not necessarily prevent arrestees, convicts, or former prisoners from searching for work, especially since for many the job search is a condition of probation and parole, they represent competing demands, and possibly demands of greater priority that could affect how much intensity and effort post-contact job seekers are able to expend during the process. So in addition to the question about why not search, why would it be the case that they would not search, I think we have to ask the question about why they would search differently post-contact than before contact. Previous research has consistently shown that some search methods are more efficient and effective than others, because they tend to yield high offer and acceptance rates while incurring relatively low costs. Network searching, directly searching to or applying to employers, and some forms of labor market intermediation, like temporary placement services or temporary employment agencies, are in general preferred. Other methods, including placing and reducing or responding to ads and searching through public employment offices, are relatively inefficient and ineffective because though the potentially low cost of searching is there, their offer rates tend to be really low, and so a lot of people often avoid these methods. Given these insights, it would seem that to make sense for offenders or the justice involved to focus their search efforts on personal contact, searching through their networks, searching through labor market intermediaries, going out and applying directly, so as to increase the likelihood of finding work. It also makes sense for them to avoid more passive forms of job search methods, which offer no clear benefit whatsoever. But what we argue is that this might not be the case. The likelihood, and this is in part drawing from my qualitative research, where I did extensive in-depth interviews with low-income Blacks who were seeking work, which included folks who had had contact with the criminal justice system. And what I found among the men who had had contact was the stigma of the criminal record made it so that they didn't actually like the idea of going to their networks to find work. They wanted to prove that they could do it on their own, right? The negative credential associated with criminal justice contact made them feel as if they had a dark spot that they had to overcome, and they felt like they could overcome it if they could find work on their own. Of course, it's really difficult as a young Black male often with lower levels of education to find work on their own, so it didn't really work out in their favor, but their thinking was, if I do this on my own, I can prove myself to members of my community. So the stigma and a desire to kind of prove that they were worthy and that they could do it on their own actually meant that they avoided using networks altogether. Many also actually avoided using labor market intermediaries because in their communities, labor market intermediaries were often associated with exploitative practices that they sought to avoid as well. But stigma, we would argue, would lead those who've had criminal justice contact to avoid networks, but it will also have a negative effect on job seekers' willingness to apply directly to employers, and for very similar reasons. The idea of asking for a job knowing that the stigma is on you would make it so that people would be less likely to want to experience that. And some of my qualitative research also suggests that people feared the rejection that they often got, and after a while just stopped doing that, stopped searching in that way because it allowed them to avoid the kind of rejection that they faced. But in terms of labor market intermediation, there have been increased opportunities to search in this way over the past 15 years, and so I actually imagine that there would be a greater likelihood of relying on this. There are a number of compulsory reentry and reintegration programs that have developed since 2000, in part to facilitate job finding and to remedy disturbingly high rates of recidivism. So this would suggest greater reliance on labor market intermediaries for job search. The tremendous growth in temporary employment agencies, as exploitative as they may be, would also contribute to helping to place these difficult to place job seekers. So this would also suggest that a substantial minority, at least, of justice-involved job seekers would search for and find work through institutional intermediaries than they had in the past. So we would expect, because of stigma, for people to move away from networks and move away from applying directly to employers, but we might expect them to move towards labor market intermediaries at the very least, because there are just so many more opportunities to do so, and many of these opportunities end up being compulsory as a result of conditions of probation and parole. We also argue that race probably matters in this process, and link it to our larger discussion about the quality and quantity of job opportunities before search options, and opportunities to search. First, we would expect racial differences in the quality and quantity of job opportunities for a couple of reasons. One, in general, Blacks are much more likely to work in the public sector, which is where many of the job restrictions apply, right? So it's either public sector or it's in private industry that is government regulated. These are much more likely to be the kinds of the places where Blacks have traditionally gone to find employment. On top of that, the industries that are more likely to be open to ex-offenders or the justice involved are those that are niches, essentially, for whites and Latinos, and these are construction and maintenance, right? So while those industries are typically open for offenders, and so would probably, and there's evidence of it, this would probably be increase the likelihood of whites and Latinos finding jobs, because these have not traditionally been niches for Blacks, and Blacks, regardless of whether or not they have criminal records, finding employment. They would probably be a bit disadvantaged in finding employment, because they would not consider those to be opportunities, since they had not traditionally been the case. So Blacks are much more likely to be employed, or traditionally have been employed, in industries that are foreclosed, and whites and Latinos are much more likely to be in industries that are actually more open to employment for the justice involved. There's also racial differences in the nature of before search options. What I talked about earlier related to debt loads, et cetera, because Blacks make less than both Latinos and whites and have greater debt loads, combined, it just produces a much greater incentive to seek work, because what would this incentive be exactly when you would make so little and have so much debt to have to deal with? And there's some suggestion that that's also the case. In terms of racial differences and opportunities to search, mostly this would be at the pre-trial stage, in part because after that point, it's not clear that Blacks or Latinos experience anything different than whites in terms of their opportunities to search. So it would be limited to the kind of early stages of criminal case processing. But each of these would suggest that we might expect to have or see differences by race and ethnicity in terms of how penal contact affects the likelihood of search. So, getting back to the question, does penal contact and do different dispositional categories affect individuals' engagement in job search? And that's whether or not they search for work at all, and how they engage among those who do search, and what effect does search engagement shaped by penal contact have on job finding success. We use the NLSY 97 panel. It's a nationally representative data set of youths, a total of almost 9,000, oversamples Blacks and Latinos. It's uniquely structured for longitudinal analysis of a whole host of life outcomes, and has been used a number of times to study the very issues that I'm dealing with today. Our sample includes those who were 18 to 21 in 2001, and we extend our analysis between 2001 and 2011 cohorts. There are almost 15,000 observations of job search episodes, which is our primary unit of analysis, with the exception of our first set of analyses on job search itself. Our outcome variables include job search, so whether or not they search for work, search content, and that's just the kind of method that they use to find work. These are not mutually exclusive categories, so one could network search while also searching through labor market intermediaries, active search and passive search. Search scope is a measure of how many search methods the job seekers used, and search success was whether or not the job search episode ended with a new job. Our primary predictor variables are penal contact. We distinguish between those who, over this 11-year period of time, had absolutely no contact with the criminal justice system. They had not been arrested, convicted, whatever. Those who are pre-contact, so these are people who, when they were pre-contact, had no contact, but eventually do go on to have contact. And we essentially compare those folks in that status to themselves once they've had contact with the penal system, so the post-contact status. Penal dispositions, we contrast the experiences of arrestees, those who've been convicted but not incarcerated, and those who've been convicted and incarcerated. And we also do our analyses separately by race. We include a whole host of controls, including age, parents' education, household income, previous work experience, which is measured in 2 ways: number of dependent children, citizenship, access to social capital, respondents' educational attainment, unemployment duration, criminal activity, year of the study. In order to correct for selection on time varying and time invariant observables and unobservables, we use a hybrid approach to regression analyses. We essentially run a set of random effects models with embedded fixed effects estimates in order to correct for these selection issues. We added weights to account for selection into search. We use multiple imputation to deal with missing data issues. Analysis were run separately by race. And then we actually included a whole host of other corrections because of the nature of the data and the issues that were involved here. So to get us kind of started in terms of thinking about these issues, we first wanted to look at patterns of search both pre and post contact, right? And so when we think about research like those of Diva Pager, who finds that, with a criminal mark of a criminal record makes it much less likely for you to make it further in the employment process to get called back. What you imagine is a job seeker who has contact, then after contact continues to search and fails at finding a job because employers are discriminating, right? So there's an assumption that underlies her analysis, or an analysis of others like her, that search is continuous throughout this process, and the problem is discrimination that leads to unemployment, right? And so this, in many ways, is that assumption that seems to underlie her set of studies and others like it, where you have search that existed both before and after contact. And what we see here is about roughly half of those who have had contact in this period had that kind of pattern of search, right? And contingent on the dispositional category, that actually varied considerably. So those who had been arrested, 51% had searched before and after. Those who had been convicted after being arrested, about a third had searched before and after. And among those who had been incarcerated, just 1/5 had searched before and after. So a good chunk, depending on which category you're thinking about, don't actually search before and after. In many cases, when they don't actually search before and after, it's often that they search before contact, and after contact, search drops off, right? Of course, we do have the category of folks who neither search before nor after, relatively small percentage, important still, but a lot of the story is around what happens after contact. For a significant minority, about a third of respondents, they search before contact, and then after contact, search drops off completely. There's no evidence of search happening. For some, they searched before contact. They didn't search before contact. And after contact, apparently they said, oh crap, I need to get myself together, and then they hit the labor market, right? But you see shifts happening for a substantial minority of folks. And in some cases, a majority of folks, if you're looking at the incarcerated and those who've been convicted. So this kind of throws up in the air this idea that this is really all about the impact of what employers are doing, which produces unemployment over this period of time. And it gets at the issue that Appel and Sweeten argue, which is that this is not just about institutional exclusion, which stops folks from getting access to opportunities. There's something else that's happening here. This is another way to look at it, and it allows us to see kind of the modal kind of search patterns by disposition. And for the incarcerated, the modal category seems to be that I search pre and then not post, right? After having contact, I stop. Among those who've been convicted, the modal categories seem to be searching pre, but not post, but also searching pre and post. For those arrested, it's by and large that they search pre and post, but up to a quarter stop searching afterwards. So we have some evidence here, descriptive, that with penal contact, there are some significant shifts that occur and that probably have implications for job finding success. So are the justice-involved young men that we study less likely to search for work? Yes, they are. So this is a set of analyses that we did, hybrid logistic regression analyses. What you're seeing here are bars, the reference category of those pre-contact, the pre-contact category. So these are the people who eventually go on to have contact, but we're looking at their search episodes before they actually do have contact. And what this indicates, we will ignore the no contact folks because we know that they're different in so many ways. And so it's not a surprise that they're much more likely to search. But what we see with the post-contact folks is that across the board, regardless of race, they're less likely to search for work after they've had contact with the penal system. And we see this across racial category and across penal dispositions. It's not just about those who've been incarcerated. It's also the case for those who've been arrested and for those who've been convicted. And across the board, these findings are significant. So with penal contact, folks are less likely to search across dispositional categories and across race. Do justice-involved job seekers search using fewer methods? And the answer is yes. This is really the way in which we should be interpreting this, is that they're less likely to use an additional method to find work. But what this shows is that relative to pre-contact job search episodes, post-contact job search episodes are less likely to include an additional method of search than if they had been pre-contact. So you're using fewer methods to find work once you've had contact with the penal system. And we find that this is the case across penal dispositions with the general trend is negative with the one exception. And for the most part, we see a number of significant findings which suggest that this is actually a thing. People across penal dispositions are using fewer methods to search. So it's not just that they're less likely to search, which is the story that Appel and Sweeten tell. What we're seeing here is that even among those who are searching, search is actually looking different in ways that suggest poor employment outcomes. Are young men's job search strategies altered? So are they searching differently? That they're using fewer methods suggests that they probably are searching differently in some ways. And so what we see here is that network search, the general trend is they're moving away from searching by using their networks, right? This is the case for post-contact in general. It's the case for black arrestees and white arrestees, is the case for those who've been convicted, and for the most part is the case for those who've been incarcerated. We see two kind of anomalies in this situation, but by and large the trend is in the direction that I would have expected. Whereas no contact folks are much more likely than pre-contact folks to use networks to find work. They're much more likely, in general, to use labor market intermediaries with the exception of arrestees. And to me, this makes sense because all of the compulsory programs are devoted to those who've actually been convicted of crime. So there's convicted and not incarcerated, or convicted incarcerated. And so the efforts to get people involved in work, these institutional support systems, are geared towards the very people that we seem to be having, this seems to be having a positive effect on their odds of using labor market intermediaries. We don't see it with arrestees. They're actually less likely to in this situation. This, to me, makes a lot of sense given recent efforts to support or reduce recidivism among those who've been convicted of crime. This is the kind of the most up in the air. What we see in terms of active search, so this is going out and applying directly to employers. Those who've been incarcerated are across the board less likely to do so, not always significantly so, but Latinos and whites are significantly less likely to do so. Blacks are less likely, but not significantly so. Among those who've been convicted, there's also the general trend in that direction. Arrestees, white and blacks, are more likely to get out and apply directly. The general trend, I would say, is that those who've been convicted, whether incarcerated or not, are less likely to actively search, and those who have been arrested maybe have some more freedom to search and are less held down by the stigma, actually go out and participate in that. But we still see a kind of movement away from the patterns that had existed before. And then passive search, essentially doing nothing but looking in a newspaper. Across the board, they're more likely to do so. Based on the interviews, the qualitative interviews I did years back, I interpret this as the efforts of people who kind of feel beleaguered by the whole process of having to find work, but wanting to feel agentic. So they pick up the newspaper, they're reading the newspaper, they're trying to engage in some way. They want to feel like they're participating in the process, but they want to avoid the kinds of strategies that put them in a place where they're likely to get rejected, right? So searching passively makes you feel like you're involved in the process. It makes you feel agentic, even when it produces very little, as we'll see later, very little in terms of job offers. So across the board, in general, we see a kind of increase in the likelihood of passive search methods. So do these differences in approaches to job search help us to explain young men's gaps in job search success? And so what we have here are a series of hybrid linear probability models of the effect of penal contact and search strategies on search success. Here I'm only focusing on those who've had contact. The blue bar represents the models only with controls, the red bar includes with scope, and the orange bar, or whatever color that is, removes scope and puts in search contact. And what we essentially get from this is by taking in consideration scope, we explain the gap, about 8 to 10% of the gap between those who've had pre-contact job seekers and those who've had contact with the criminal justice system. So just about a tenth of the difference we were able to explain with search scope. What we're able to explain between 20 and 22% of the differences, especially, between white, blacks, and Latinos when we include search contact. How it is that people search ends up making a whole bit of difference in terms of whether or not people find search, and explains about a quarter, slightly under a quarter of the gap between those who are pre-contact and those who go on to have contact. And we see those differences too arise with regards to penal disposition. I'm not going to present those here though. So this is both a story. This is a story of detachment for sure, as Appel and Sweeten argue. Justice involvement does reduce the odds of searching for work across dispositional categories. Future research should pay attention to some of the issues that I've raised over the course of this talk, including whether or not local and state level restrictions on employment for justice involved has an impact on the extent to which people are willing to search for work and have and affects their odds of employment. Justice involved men and women's perceptions of the quality and quantity of opportunities available to them. To what extent does that shape their willingness to search and what their search effort looks like? And what's the effect of legal financial obligations, both in terms of whether they exist or how much they have on one's willingness to search? My argument would be the higher that these are, the greater the debt load, the less likely people will feel like it's something that they want to participate in part because it reduces significantly the incentive of doing so. But this is also an unemployment story. So Appel and Sweeten argue that really the issue here is not one of unemployment, it's solely about detachment. I think our evidence here shows that it's both one about detachment and unemployment. There are the set of folks who don't search, but then there are a whole number of people who do search, but their search changes in significant ways, in ways that reduce the likelihood that they will find work, and that's what we see here. Justice involvement does have a negative effect on how individuals search for work, which affects their search success. Future research should look into the extent to which and how penal contact affects individuals' opportunities to search, as well as how they search. And we should also think about for whom the stigma of justice involvement matters in terms of how they search or why. I have two hows there. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm ready to take questions. Thank you. Sure. You know my name, so I want to know yours.
Oh, great. Hi, Susan. I'm Trish.
I'm Sandra, actually.
I'm Sandra.
Susan's the middle name. I'm going to forgive you because
Sorry.
everyone
Hi,
does that.
Sandra. I'm Trish.
Uh-huh.
I actually have two questions, if I may. One is, you talk about the God, I'm not going to say it, labor market
Intermediary.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I'm stuck. At any rate, are you referring to temporary staffing agencies? Who are you referring to?
There are a whole there are a number of different categories of labor market intermediation. So there are temporary employment agencies, there are regular employment agencies that seek to link people to jobs. What I think is by and large having an effect on these job seekers that I'm focused on are actually those that are associated, they're not major formal institutions. They're connected to probation and parole departments. They're actually connected to the criminal justice system, and their attempt is to help transition men and women who are leaving either prison or probation to help them get jobs so that they'll be able to re-enter with fewer difficulties, more smoothly. So that's part of the issue here. What Vischer and Kachnowski have shown is that among the Illinois men that they followed, they were actually more likely to be employed immediately after leaving, and that was in part because they got so much help, so much institutional support in making the transition. So those efforts become really very important in terms of linking these men for jobs, even if it's just for the short term, which is what their work found.
The second question was, all of the research that you've done and these outcomes that you've shared with us, is this strictly the young?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
So it's just the youth. Have you done any research around adult? And if so, is there?
Well, these are young adults, but I'm not done. I mean, our sample goes up to about age 28, so they're relatively young adults. They start out relatively young at 18, so it's about that 10-year span. I've not done any research that looks at older folks who've had criminal justice contact. I think it's a really important question. You imagine that these people might have more experience, et cetera, and so they might approach the process very differently. But this is the first kind of study of its kind looking at these particular patterns, and so the patterns are really kind of important and interesting nonetheless, but I think we should be paying more attention to what's happening to older folks.
So you don't have in this set of findings any impact relative to first age of contact with criminal justice system? Does it?
No, we don't.
Mine is somewhat related too. Did you look at all at the variation of the incarceration experience itself, so that those that had job training or skills building or education opportunities had a very different post job search situation?
We didn't break it down in the way that you're describing. I mean, we control for education at various levels. It's not quite clear that with the NLSY, you can identify folks who've had criminal justice contact and say had been incarcerated and then experience training related to that. The NLSY doesn't have that level of detail around one's experiences, and so it would be difficult to track that. What you can do is to track with each job search episode what levels of education they have at that point, right? So, and that would vary, assuming that they increase, and there are some increases in levels of education. So we do that, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily related to the criminal justice contact that they've had, and here's the training you're receiving in order to kind of help you move forward. If that was the kind of training that they received, we would not know it because it's never tagged in that way in NLSY.
Did you ask those questions in your qualitative work?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, thank you for the wonderful talk. My name is Boroka, and
Really?
yeah, I know.
You and I say hi to each other every single day.
I know, but
Okay.
in case you didn't know my name,
Yeah, I know your name.
I was wondering about the network search decrease, and if your data potentially would be able to highlight network size decrease in addition to stigma. You talked
Yeah.
about stigma, but I'm wondering how incarceration or even contact with the justice system would affect the decrease.
Erosion, yeah.
Exactly, of the overall network,
Right.
and maybe how that is race and class based even?
What we do is track, so we have our social capital control, and that captures whether or not they have access to people that they can talk to about employment issues, but also about education issues. So it's kind of broad, although it does have an impact on one's likelihood of using a network, et cetera. And you can track that over time as well, but we can't see so we can see whether or not they say, yes, we have someone like that or not, but I don't know that we can see how much erosion happens as a result of it. I think the control, though, does take into consideration whether or not they have someone or some ones that they can access in that way, but the level of change over time, I'm not sure that we can do. I'll check with Nora, who's my co-author on this, around that issue. I think it's a really good one. And it gets at one of the issues that folks mention, right? With contact, especially incarceration, you see social capital eroding over time, you lose contact with people. Given how long these young people tend to be away, it's unclear that erosion would be a problem for them, because usually if they're incarcerated at this age, it's just for a few months, so not enough to truly erode one's network, but I think it's a good question nonetheless, and I'll check into that. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kate. My question is sort of a summarizing question. I was trying to come up with a story about racial ethnic differences in the effect of incarceration on job search and perhaps the potential for subsequent employment. And I was wondering if you could summarize whether you feel like there are big racial ethnic differences or not.
I actually don't think that there are big racial and ethnic differences. I do think that there are size differences, right? So there are a couple of findings. So Blacks, the effect of having contact on searching, the effect is larger for Blacks and then Latinos and then whites. And so you see differences in effect size, but the general trends seem to be roughly the same, right? So we're seeing very similar patterns, and it's just about the size of the effect, which I think is interesting, noteworthy. But I wouldn't say, ooh, this is the situation for Blacks, and it's very different from those of other groups. I think it's more of a difference of degree than kind. Sure, yeah.
Thanks. I was curious about demand-side behaviors and how detachment occurs in light of them. And so what are employers legally allowed to ask on an application? Do they only ask about incarcerations, but also about convictions, about charges, and then what would come up in a background check?
So what generally comes up in the background check is if you've been arrested, for, I'm sorry? Even without a charge. And for some employers, that's enough to just disqualify you, because that clearly shows that you are a bad person of bad character. So that's one of the issues. We should also mention that employers often now do, the overwhelming majority of employers now do criminal background checks because it's so easy and it's so cheap. They're also doing credit histories, right? Which, if you have these legal debts, means that you end up looking, especially if you're poor and so you can't pay them off, you end up looking like a poor credit risk, and so you are also someone that who would be discounted. What can you ask? You can ask if there are these ban-the-box initiatives, and I think even New York State now has required that employers not ask that unless it's specifically related to the charge that they were somehow convicted of was related to the kind of work that they're going to be doing. But recent reports in the New York Times indicate that there's a lot of pushback from employers around that issue. So I think it might take us some time before we get to a place where people feel comfortable not asking about or checking on one's history. So yeah, there are all sorts of openings for identifying flaws in individuals, and I think as long as the market is the way it is, these workers or these job seekers will be severely disadvantaged.